Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another episode review from the Are You Afraid of the Dark television series from the 90s and early 2000s. This episode comes from season 6, which is the first revival era season. It was written by Randy Holland and directed by Laurette LeBlanc. The episode in question is The Tale of Bigfoot Ridge. Now, this episode I actually watched for the first time in a casual setting, I think last year or maybe late 2022. And this was actually one of the last handful of Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes I had to watch in a casual setting to complete my watch through that I began in, COVID years, maybe in 2020. And it took me a while to finish all the episodes because some of them were on YouTube and some of them were on Paramount Plus when that dropped, but then a few were missing again, so I had to find them on like Daily Motion. It took a while to track all the episodes down and finally watch them, but yeah, I'm finally glad that I got to Bigfoot Ridge. And I can't remember if I saw this episode when it first aired in the late 90s, and I think this would have come out in 1999 or maybe 2000, and I was watching Nickelodeon around that time, so there are a few episodes that I do remember watching from this time period. Like I said, I couldn't tell if I watched it back then, but to my cognitive knowledge, I first time watched it not too long ago. And I actually wanted to review this a while ago, like I think about 6 or 7 months ago. But I was moving at the point and I never got around to it, and I completely forgot to make a review. So here we are again. I rewatched it for posterity and have a review for you all for this criminally underrated Are You Afraid of the Dark episode. Is it the most underrated or overlooked gem in the series? I don't think so. But is it a top 10 contender? In my opinion, yeah. For Are You Afraid of the Dark standards, this episode stands out. And for kids' horror, this episode stands out because, to my knowledge, this is the only kids' horror episode I've ever seen that features a complete and real snowy landscape. Yes, they actually filmed this episode in a snowy environment. So to everyone out there that thinks that snowy Goosebumps episodes or whatnot from other productions couldn't have worked, look to this episode no further. I think that's kind of debunked. Maybe if they were willing to not put as much budget because of the snow, so be it. But yeah, this episode is a fun change of pace and very unique for that. But putting that aside, I think that this episode showcases not only what made Are You Afraid of the Dark resonate with kids, but this is definitely one of the best revival season episodes in my opinion. It doesn't hit quite as high as you'll see in my review as some of my other favorites from this time period, but it's easily in the top 5 episodes from this time period for me. So for that, if you have not seen The Tale of Bigfoot Ridge, as you'll hear very shortly, you should check this out, especially if you're a fan of episodes like Night of the Living Dummy 3 from Goosebumps, which is a 2-parter, R.L. Stine special. That episode starred Hayden Christensen. Here's your other Hayden Christensen kids horror episode too. So take that for what you will. So let's get into the plot of this episode. I will be going over some spoilers, some minor, some mildly big ones. So if you're not interested in hearing that, now's the time to click off and go watch the episode and then come back. But if you've already seen the episode or you don't mind, feel free to listen. So this episode begins like all Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes. And I go over this in every review because not a lot of people know how Are You Afraid of the Dark operates. It's because I'm mainly a Goosebumps channel. And a good amount of you have told me you haven't experienced the show before. So every episode begins with this club called the Midnight Society. And whatever season or whatever iteration they have going on, they end up meeting in the woods. And they gather around this campfire, and whoever's turn it is to share a story will grab the dust and throw it on the fire and share their tale. And sometimes they like to tie in some themes into what the Midnight Society are discussing before the segment begins and after the segment wraps up. But that's beyond the point. So when this episode begins, we get to meet the main two characters of the story, which are, I think, twin siblings. They look around the same age. They could be separated by a few years. I don't know. But the main character is Danny, who's played by Brooke Nevin. If you don't know who Brooke Nevin is, she was in the Animorphs show from Nickelodeon back in the day. And then Kirk is played by Hayden Christensen, who is her brother. And they live in a mountain resort type of environment, or at least near one, because there's a ski lodge and ski lifts and people snowboarding, and everybody's enjoying the snowy tundra. And it appears to be in winter, and it's very cold. And as they're hanging out, along with their peers and doing snow shenanigans, Danny, who's up in her feels about her friend Gina, who has gone missing, but we don't know how long she's been missing, and the episode never explains it. But in her emotional feels as she's talking with her brother, she thinks she hears a familiar voice calling to her, and she looks over to the side and thinks that she sees her friend Gina. And when she tries to go over to her friend, she kind of vanishes in thin air. And this really perturbs Danny, and Kirk notices his sister going through some really hard times, and she heads home by herself, and Kirk decides to come back later on his own and finds his sister in the house, doing some homework, thinking about what happened. And Kirk's talking with Danny, and Danny gives some backstory and some insight to the audience about Gina and how she disappeared one day, and they never were able to find her, and they sent search and rescue and everything. And she's really worried that Gina, if she is not found soon, she could die out there in the elements. And Kirk is trying to be real with Danny and says, it's going to be really hard for her to be out there, Danny. So if Gina, has been out there for this long, you might have to accept that something has happened to her. And it's really raw about that. You want to think that, right? But after this conversation, Danny thinks that she's hearing Gina's voice and asking for her to help her. And later on that night, she's watching television and watching, I guess, home video tapes of her hanging out with her brother and her best friend Gina. And Gina, through the television, is now communicating, talking to Danny, saying, "You need to help me, and you might be able to find me here at Bigfoot Ridge," or whatever, and leaves a sign, right? And Danny takes that to heart, and when she wakes up the next morning, she decides that she's going to brave the day and take the snowmobile that belongs to the family and go to this place called Bigfoot Ridge, which is about 30 miles away. And when her brother Kirk stops her and is asking, "What are you doing? Where are you going?" she explains that she's going to go to Bigfoot Ridge that's 30 miles away, and she thinks that Gina possibly could be there. And Kirk's like, "What makes you think that she would be there? That's way out of the way." And Danny's like, "Well, the search and rescue never searched for Gina that far out, so I'm going to go look myself." So Kirk reluctantly tells his sister, "There's going to be a snowstorm coming. You might be stuck out there because you're so far away." And she's like, "Well, that's a risk I'm willing to take. I want my best friend back." So Danny, of course, hops on the snowmobile and heads towards Bigfoot Ridge by herself. And it comes to a point where she takes a pause and notices that she thinks she sees Gina in the snow again. This time she's snowboarding down the mountain towards Bigfoot Ridge, and it's kind of implied that she's telling Danny to follow her. And we don't necessarily know what's going on, but something supernatural might be going on, right? Or this might be all in Danny's mind. Well, Danny arrives at this cabin, I guess this destination on Bigfoot Ridge that Gina was subliminally telling her in the videotape. And when she arrives there, she notices that there's no power in the building, but there could be somebody inside, and it would be a good place to hide out if there was a snowstorm, and if somebody was stuck, it's better than being out in the elements. So when she goes inside, she hears a voice as she's wandering in, and she's stopped by her brother, who has revealed that he's followed Danny to make sure that she's okay and not doing this alone, right? But when they go inside of the room, when they hear the voice of this person in there, they realize that there's something weird going on, because this woman is a very old woman, and there's a revelation that this old woman is like, hey, I'm Gina. And the kids believe him. And there's a whole thing where Gina's like, well, there's a creature called the Umbra. And I didn't mention this, but the two siblings actually had an interaction with what appeared to be Gina, but had green glowing eyes coming after them in the dark. And they ran into the room where there was a fire. And this old woman who claims to be the real Gina tells her best friend and Kirk what happened. And she got lost, and she thought she was following somebody on a snowmobile, and it took her all the way up to this cabin. And when she got in there, the glowing eyes stuff started, and it caused this phenomenon. And now she feels like she's aged quite a few years and has no energy. But for some reason, she's picked up that this creature does not like the light and stays away from the fire. That's why she's been hiding out in this room for as long as she has, because if she leaves, she's in danger of being attacked by the Umbra again. And the kids have no idea what the Umbra is, and we never really know how Gina knows that this thing is called an Umbra, but just go with it, right? So after this moment, the kids realize they're going to be stuck in here for the night, and the snowstorm's going to come, and they have this creature lurking in the shadows. So there's some stakes involved where they have to maintain the fire, and they're running out of firewood. And they have overhead lights, but there's no power to the building except for a generator out back that they need to go outside and click on at some point. And they also have a flashlight that they can use, but the batteries are running low. So the access to light to fend off the Umbra is going to be hard to do. And it comes down to the wire, essentially, where after they've been hiding out and trying to explore more of the lodge, but they keep having these interactions with the Umbra, and there's a whole thing that Gina explains that you should not stare into the eyes of it, because if you do, it's going to weaken you, and you're going to be under its trance, and you got to cover your eyes and stay near the light, and that's really the only known way to stay out of it. And the kids try to venture out of the room a couple of times, but it doesn't really work. It comes down to a point where the fire logs are running low, and they know that the fire is going to be hard to upkeep. And as the room is getting darker, the Umbra is able to come through the shadows a little bit to mess around with older Gina specifically. It looks like it's trying to finish Gina off before it gets to the other kids. And also, I should mention, there's an implication in the story that there's some bodies in the lodge that's been stored, like dead bodies, that Gina knows about because she's been in the lodge for a while. Yeah, all off-screen implications, but pretty wild. And once the Umbra starts to attack Gina, Danny urges Kirk that, we need to turn on the generator. We need to get these lights on because we're going to run out of wood. And that flashlight's not reliable. So can you do that? And Kirk's like, of course. So Kirk decides to brave at night in this snowstorm to go out back in the freezing cold, where he can freeze to death really quick, I should say, to turn on the generator. But for him, he notices that there's a lock on the generator, and this is going to put some time on getting it done. Meanwhile, this is where we get to the climax of the story. The fire is starting to dwindle down to the point where the Umbra has come into the room with Danny and Gina, as Gina is already too weak to fend off the Umbra herself, and Danny, it gets attacked and, of course, stares into the eyes, and the Umbra starts to, take away from Danny. But we see that Kirk may or may not save the day, right? And gets the generator turned on, and we see what happens with the Umbra. And once this wraps up, we get some closure about Gina and what's going to happen to her moving forward, and then the remaining three kids and how they get out of the lodge potentially and all that. And then once that happens, the story ends, and we get caught back up to the Midnight Society, who closes out the episode, and the credits roll. So that, in a nutshell, is what you're going to expect out of the tale of Bigfoot Ridge. I'm going to say this off the bat. The one thing I think that really stands out in memory every time I think about this episode is the setting. I think the setting of this episode is so atmospheric. If you love winter themed stories, like for example, if you love more and more and more tales to give you goosebumps, which is the holiday slash winter themed short story collection from Goosebumps. If you love 12 Screams of Christmas from Most Wanted, Fright Christmas, or any Christmas kids horror story out there, maybe you're a fan of the Haunting Hour ones, you should give Bigfoot Ridge a legitimate shot because this is true winter theme on display in a kids horror episode, and it looks believable. It looks like, if you don't know, Are You Afraid of the Dark is a Canadian show. They probably went to an actual mountainous area somewhere, maybe in the Appalachians or out in the Rockies, and they filmed on location in cold weather, and they actually had the actors in real coats, and you could see the breath on the air as they're commuting dialogue, and it's fascinating to see that they actually tried to pull this off, and I have to tip my hat to them for this. I think Are You Afraid of the Dark went above and beyond to make a super atmospheric episode. And that goes into the set design and how creepy this cabin of Bigfoot Ridge is. Yeah, when you hear the title Bigfoot Ridge, this episode is a big old clickbait on the title. There is no Sasquatch monster here. It's an Umbra shadow being, right? But the cabin itself, it feels isolated. There's nothing else around them. And that is mainly where we get the story circumvented inside. And there's just a really creepy factor going on in this house. It's hard to explain. It just all works so well. And with that snow isolation, you buy into the believability of the characters. Now, the characters, I think, are very well done for Are You Afraid of the Dark standards. I think Danny and Kirk are some of the best sibling characters in Are You Afraid of the Dark. They have great chemistry. Brooke Nevin and Hayden Christensen did a phenomenal job in the lead roles of this story. And they're not jerks to each other. Like, Kirk is one of the most supportive sibling characters I've seen in kids horror, and Hayden Christensen, like I said, brings out really great heroic qualities within his character. Honestly, Kirk might be one of my favorite Are You Afraid of the Dark characters alongside Danny. And Brooke Nevin, while I haven't seen much things I've been totally impressed with her in, this has to be her best acting performance I've seen her give in anything. She was great as this character. And the emotions in the story is super relatable. And the story really leans into that. And it becomes more of a thematic message about, losing a friend and trying to keep their memory alive. And I think the writer here, Randy Holland, sewn in some solid emotional depth with Danny and how, her friend's gone missing and how she wants to go find her, but there's limitations with the snow and the tundra and all of that. But she is willing to travel 30 miles in that just to go find a possibility of finding her friend. And it just shows how, desperate people can get when they're longing for somebody that they love and care about. And I don't know. And when you get the final message on the end note of the story, where we get, the send-off, where you get the potential happy ending that Are You Afraid of the Dark always has. This is one of the few times in Are You Afraid of the Dark that the happy ending isn't corny from forced elements. No, it feels earned and it feels organic. And the character stuff in this is really good. Really, really good. I'm going to say this as well. The character villain of the Umbra is a super threatening villain and is probably one of the most threatening Are You Afraid of the Dark villains. And while, it's rather simple to defeat the villain, as I've mentioned in the plot overview, this isn't even a spoiler. It's said really early on, once this Umbra thing is revealed in the story, that it has a weakness to light. While it has a very obvious weakness, and, you can look at it cut and dry like that, like a vampire, right? What it's able to do, it has a lot of abilities. Like, it can communicate through a TV, and it can lure people, I guess, in visions, or it can manifest itself in sunlight, which is mildly confusing. We'll get into that in the negatives pretty freaking soon. But it seems like it's baiting people to come to this cabin and luring them there to make them victims. And that's insane. The fact that it has a body count is crazy. And yeah, while the green eyes glowing stuff is kind of weird, and the whole stealing the youth part of the story doesn't really feel like it needs to be there, I think that for the most part, the Umbra really does work, and there's a pretty decent climax involved. And I don't know how they are able to pull it off here. Sometimes in kids' horror, they get it right, but they pulled off how John Carpenter pulled off Michael Myers in that original 1978 Halloween movie. You feel Michael Myers' presence in the movie without seeing him. You feel the Umbra's presence all throughout this episode without seeing it, because anytime it starts to get dim or there's a shadow lurking nearby, it's probably there. And it's waiting for an opportunity to keep attacking these kids. And that's hardcore. That's hardcore for kids' horror. And it really does paint the tension of the story really well. And yeah, I just think that those positives are really strong ones. And they really do help this episode wholesale. Because when I get to the negatives, I do have a few things that I'm going to beat up about it. Okay? So, I can really scrutinize the idea of Bigfoot Ridge. We can look on the clickbait title, right? Why is it Bigfoot Ridge when it has nothing to do with a Sasquatch? I can really, kind of, scrutinize the idea of Danny and Kirk traveling 30 miles when there's a snowstorm coming at night without telling their parents that they're going to an unknown location where Gina possibly could be. That just doesn't really sound realistic. And I can also be really hard on a few things like, how did Gina start a fire to begin with in this cabin? And all of that. But what I am going to be hard on, the first thing here, is that the Umbra, the main characters, Danny and Kirk, have no idea what this thing is. There's no local legend implying that there's an Umbra anywhere. But when they meet old Gina in the cabin, Gina has all this wealth of knowledge about the Umbra, because she's been here for a presumed amount of time. She knows that there's bodies in another room. She started a fire at this point. She's so weak and frail that she's stuck on the couch, right? But somehow she knows what this thing is in terms of like a species, and what its abilities are and all of that. And I'm just thinking, like, why is Gina being the purveyor of the plot to explain all this, right? And it feels like it's just being dumped with her character. It's never explained how Gina knows this. How does Gina know all this, right? And when you really think about it, right, she says explicitly, the Umbra has a light weakness. It hates firelight. It hates flashlight. It hates overhead electrical lights. But in the story, Danny is being taunted and shown who she thinks is Gina, but it's actually the Umbra in broad daylight in reflective white snow where it amplifies the light numerous times. So what is the Umbra doing? Is it astral projecting its essence to mess with her? Is it throwing its voice 30 miles away to communicate with her? Does it have some magical abilities where it can possess televisions? Like, it's hilariously inconsistent with how the story handles the villain of the Umbra and its abilities. But the main thing I'm trying to highlight here is the weakness, right? It was in broad daylight so many times. Why isn't it dead already? You know what I mean? It's like, it's really dumb when you think about it, right? I'm going to be honest. My last negative with this episode is once Danny and Kirk get into the cabin, that mid portion, it gets kind of bland. It takes about 5 or 6 minutes to actually click on to the events of the climax at this point of the episode. And while I can be a little more forgiving on that because it is setting up tension, and there is some tension already there because we already know that the Umbra is lurking nearby and it could be coming out at any point, but nothing is happening because they're stuck in this room basically, and it's just retreading old ground about Gina feeling weaker because she's getting old, and It's getting dark, so they need to find a solution, blah, 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 blah. It's just like, just do more with the concept already. Like, why are you just chilling in this room doing nothing? I mean, I guess that's fitting for the story, but yeah, it gets kind of boring in the mid portion, you know? And then it clicks back on, it gets a little exciting again. But yeah, with those negatives aside, do I think that this episode is great? A 4.5 or higher? Yes. Despite the flaws I have with it. To me, I think that Bigfoot Ridge has those noticeable quirks that if I point them out to you, you can't unsee them. And I equate this episode to how I feel about the Haunting Hours mascot episode. But unlike that, I feel like here, while that episode is scarier, there's a lot more unforgivable BS going on there than here. And I also feel like because of the emotions and the characters are so good here, I'm willing to be more forgiving than I probably would be if those things weren't as good. You know, this would probably score a lower than a 4.5, maybe like to a mid B tier. But because they're so strong, I'm willing to give it a 4.5 or higher. And where I settled with those negatives, I decided to be a little more forgiving than I usually am. And I gave this about a 4.6 out of 5 stars. This could be on my top 10 Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes, all said and done at some point. We'll get to the end of the reviews at some point, and I'll make a, ranking all the episodes from worst to best probably. This most likely will be in the top 15. It might be super close around that number 10 spot. I don't know where it's going to land, but it possibly could be there. And I'd be perfectly happy putting this episode on there because I thought this episode was great, despite its flaws. And the fact that this episode is right there in release time with two of my all-time favorite Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes, Vampire Town and Secret Admirer. This marks, in my opinion, the greatest 3-episode stretch that Are You Afraid of the Dark ever had, which was Vampire Town, this episode, and Secret Admirer. You do not have a better 3-episode stretch in the show's history, in my opinion. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the tale of Bigfoot Ridge. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this episode before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.